foreign aid doing any good when it comes to economic development. The Burnside and Dollar result, although it's disputed, but this notion that aid works where policies are good, and then they revise this and say that aid works if institutions are good, this holds a lot of attraction in the popular imagination, and it comes at the same time that there's some other academic research showing that regardless of foreign aid flows, having good institutions is good for economic growth, that well-governed countries lead to better economic outcomes. And so this leads to what I think is our first post-Washington consensus, that is on institutions. So the academic research supports that institutions lead to growth. This leads to lots of development industry discussion of good governance, of institutional reform, of anti-corruption. The United States creates a new foreign aid agency that explicitly aims at only giving money to countries that have good institutions or that are improving their institutions, and that is the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So there's some evidence that the development industry has really shifted its attitudes and has started giving more money to countries with good institutions. But what remains unresolved here within this post-Washington consensus is what to be done with the countries that have poor institutions, that are poorly governed. It's very difficult to know how to get countries to change their institutions. You can put conditionality in place, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through to get a country that has poorly performing courts to suddenly have well-performing courts, or to get a country where elections are not free and fair to have free and fair elections. There's also a sticky little issue here about foreign aid possibly harming institutions. That governments that are financed by foreign donors are less accountable to people within the country because they have less of a need to collect taxes or otherwise raise domestic resources, and that therefore getting lots of foreign aid actually leads to institutional deterioration for those reasons. So how involved should the development industry be if involvement can actually lead to institutional degradation, and we think that good institutions are what lead to growth? And then it's somewhat unclear to me about the extent to which donors have changed their programming as of yet, and I think that's an interesting area for research. So looking at some of the other things that have happened, so keep this in your mind as one of the things that has happened in the post-Washington consensus era, this new concern for institutions. One of the things that happened during the structural adjustment era, as these negative impacts on the poor of structural adjustment programs were noted, a new type of foreign aid project called a social fund came into being. One of the first was in Bolivia. And then this has translated into a series of projects that are very highly regarded in the foreign aid community and are known as community-driven development projects or participatory development projects. What this represents is a return to focusing on poverty alleviation. And the way that these projects work is that they say, local people should make local decisions about what is going to most benefit their community. So let's put money in the hands of citizens to make decisions about how to spend that money. I think that this comes fairly straightforwardly out of the failure of these large-scale macroeconomic oriented programs of the structural adjustment era. And then, of course, the other thing that happens vis-a-vis poverty alleviation is that we introduce this set of 8 Millennium Development Goals, which build on a little-known set of 7 international development goals that the OECD had produced in 1996, and they also build on a set of UN-sponsored conferences in the early 1990s. But in 2000, the Millennium Development Goals are announced, set for 2015, aiming to reduce poverty, to reduce hunger, to reduce child mortality, maternal mortality, to equalize education, to achieve universal primary school enrollment, to get the wealthy countries of the world to kick in more, and to protect the natural environment. So we've seen a new focus on poverty. Here's the good news. There's been a lot of progress on the Millennium Development Goals. A lot of these goals are being met. Here's the caveat. I don't think it has anything to do with the Millennium Development Goals. That is, targets have been established, they're being met, but I think the targets would have been met even if the targets had never been written down. This is not to say that the Millennium Development Goals are bad. I think they're great for making people aware of issues, but I don't think that they are leading towards progress on poverty. I think that what's leading towards progress on poverty is economic growth. Because the most progress on the Millennium Development Goals has been experienced in places that have been experiencing large-scale economic growth. We can see this quickly in some maps of the world. So here is a map of MDG Progress, where dark green indicates more progress. And we see that there's been lots of progress on the Millennium Development Goals in places like China, Vietnam, Brazil, Indonesia, places that have been experiencing economic growth during the period that the Millennium Development Goals have been in existence. The other thing that it's important to note is that we see a lot of variation in terms of the individual Millennium Development Goals. So for instance, we're not doing so well when it comes to reducing maternal health. A lot of red. Child mortality looks similar. If we look at HIV/AIDS, most of the countries in the world are off target. And again, these targets are best being met in countries that are experiencing economic growth and are not being met in the countries where the efforts of the Millennium Development Project have really been focused, that is the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Across almost all the indicators, we see lots of red in sub-Saharan Africa. Another way of looking at this is to look at the poverty numbers over time. So since 1980, we've seen a very large-scale decrease in the proportion of the world, not the absolute number, but the proportion of the world living in poverty. So if you're a big fan of structural adjustment, well, look from 1980 to 1990 here, and the number of people, the proportion of people in the world living on less than $1 a day, it went down quite a bit. If you're a fan of the Millennium Development Goals, well, we continue to see some progress in the early 21st century. But once again, if we look at where this progress is actually occurring, we need to point to China. This decline in the proportion of the world's population living in poverty has been almost entirely concentrated in East Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa, approximately the same proportion of the continent's population that was living in poverty in 1980 is still living in poverty, about 42%. South Asia has seen some declines because of economic growth in India primarily. In the Latin American and Caribbean region, about the same proportion of people living in extreme poverty are still living in extreme poverty. And then there are very low rates of extreme poverty in Europe and Central Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. And then this huge decline, mostly because of economic growth in China, that's been experienced in the East Asia and the Pacific. So we've seen a return to focusing on poverty alleviation again. I think that's good. I don't want you to walk out of here saying Matt Winters thinks that's bad that we're focused on poverty alleviation. But I think that the most successful poverty alleviation comes from economic growth. So the Millennium Development Goals are great, but they also need to be recognized for what they are. And that is probably not the main drivers of poverty alleviation in the world. So if the first element of the post-Washington consensus has been institutional,